Okay, Thomas Freed here, tax-freedom.com and the at Tax Freedom channel on YouTube. That's a tax-freedom. This is part 3 of examining and exposing the fraudulent nature of the income tax and the deception the IRS and the DOJ have been perpetrating on the American people for 80 years, since the end of World War II. Since, of course, nobody paid any income tax on their earnings derived from the simple exercise of the right to work until World War II and the victory tax. So, in part 1 and part 2, well, I'm not going to completely review part 1 and part 2 the way I reviewed part 1 in part 2 at the beginning. So if you didn't catch part 1 or part 2, you need to go watch at least part 2 because I reviewed part 1, but probably should look at them both. But this is part 3, and we're up to the point in the law where we're going to examine the statutory liability for the payment of the tax resulting in the requirement to file a tax return, allegedly. So, where do we start? Well, we start with Notice 609, the IRS's notice to you under the Privacy Act. And this notice says to you that when we first ask for information, we must first tell you our legal right to ask for the information, why we are asking for it, and how it will be used. So they can't ask you for a tax return without explaining why they're asking for it and why you need to provide it. And it says this notice applies to tax returns and any papers filed with them. So Notice 609 is your notice of your right to be told why you got to do this. File a tax return for the income tax. And they go on to try and do that for you right here in the notice to shut it all down. Our legal right to ask for information is Internal Revenue Code section 6001, 6011, 6012A, and their regulations. Now, fortunately, we're not going to have to go look at these 3 code sections right out of the gate here. We'll probably do that later on in another video, but right now we're not going to because the IRS has interpreted them for us. The IRS tells us exactly what they do to create a requirement. And they say our legal right to ask for information is Internal Revenue Code section 6001, 6011, 6012 and their regulations. They say that you must file a return or statement with us for any tax that you are liable for. Your response is mandatory under these sections. Now, liability for tax, if it's going to be an enforceable liability for tax, can only arise under statute because our courts are only authorized, if you remember from subject matter jurisdiction in part 1, are only authorized to enforce written laws. They can't enforce ideas or concepts or habits or principles or even common sense. They can only enforce the written law. So in order for you to be liable for a tax, they're going to need to show a statute that says you're liable for it. So what we're going to do is go look at the statutes that make a person liable for the payment of the taxes. Here we go. First section, 7501, liability for taxes withheld or collected. Whenever any person is required to collect or withhold any internal revenue tax from any other person or to pay over such tax in the United States, the amount of tax so collected or withheld shall be held to be a special fund and trust for the United States. Well, gee, that doesn't even say that you're liable for it, but it says that all collected taxes, and if you remember, the withholding agent is the tax collector under the subtitle A body of law, which are the income tax laws that were enacted originally in 1913, as opposed to the distinct and separate body of law that was enacted 32 years later in 1945 as the subtitle C, employment tax laws, where the class of tax collectors created in 1945 are the employers, who, much like the withholding agents, collect tax by deducting money as tax from taxable payments made to taxable persons. The distinction, of course, is that withholding agents are only allowed to collect tax from foreign persons, as we saw in part 1, and the employer is only allowed to collect tax from people, employees, who allow it and request it on a Form W-4, which is the Employees Withholding Allowance Certificate. So of course it makes sense that anyone who's collected the tax, the money's not for them, they're made liable for it, and in this case they got to turn it into a special trust fund, right? And 7809 says it has to be deposited into the Treasury on a daily basis, and regulations modify the daily basis to weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly, and most employers and withholding agents send in withheld taxes on a quarterly basis, so they don't have to do it every day or every week. Other liability statutes. Well, here they are. Title 26, that's what we're looking for. 2032, who's liable for the estate tax? 3102, the FICA tax. 3202, the railroad retirement tax. 3505, employment taxes. That's also under 3403. Maybe that's, we're going to get to that later. 4002 and 4003, luxury passenger tax, heavy trucks, manufacturer, excise, tax on wages, occupational, vehicle, petroleum, chemicals, qualified employer pensions, failure to satisfy coverage requirement of group health plans, failure to meet certain group plan requirements, plans reducing benefit accruals, tax on distilled spirits, tax on wines, tax on distilled spirits, wine, beer, tobacco, more tobacco. 1461, State 2 is made liable for the payment of the federal personal income tax. That's in Subtitle A. At 3403, State 2 is liable for the payment of the federal personal income tax and the other taxes that are collected by the employer under Subtitle C. That's the Subtitle C. This is 3403 is 1945. 1461 is 1913. Isn't it interesting that both subtitles, the legislative act that enacted both subtitles, uses exactly the same scheme of indirect taxation? Collection by a tax collector who was actually the party made liable for the payment of the tax that he has collected from the group of persons he's authorized and allowed to collect tax from. Withholding agents collect from foreigners, and there was no authority whatsoever in law to collect tax from citizens until 1945. You don't really think they wrote a law in 1913 that applied to all citizens' labors, and then they put no authority at all in law to collect it from them? But they did put authority in law to collect it from the foreign non-resident aliens subject to the Tariff Act. The Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, the original legislation enacting the tax? Maybe, do you think? 7501 again was the collection of the tax we saw at the beginning. Subtitle A, 1461. There's one other statute, 1463. And this says, if any person fails to deduct and withhold any tax, and thereafter the tax against which such tax may be credited is paid. So they're talking about the withholding agent. He fails to deduct and withhold, but if the government is able to collect the tax from the non-resident alien, okay, then the tax so required to be deducted and withheld shall not be collected from the withholding agent who failed. But this section shall in no case relieve such person from liability for interest or any penalties or additions to tax otherwise applicable in respect of such failure to deduct and withhold. You mean it's not the individual wage earner who's subject to interest, penalties, or additions to tax, but it's the withholding agent who failed to collect it who pays those penalties? Geez, that's what the law says. The withholding agent who's liable for the interest, penalties, in addition to tax, and the withholding agent is liable for what he's collected. Not the wage earner who's liable. Remember Treasury decision 2313? I think that was near the end of part 1, where the Treasury had to declare in the decision that non-resident aliens are liable for the tax because the law doesn't do it. The law only makes the withholding agents liable. To even make the wage earner liable, the non-resident alien with no rights, hereby privilege of green card or being allowed to work in agriculture or some other part-time job on a temporary basis as a non-resident alien. Those are the taxable parties under the original act. And subtitle C, the employer shall be liable. So we see here that the penalties aren't laid on the wage earner, they're laid on the collector for failing the duty. Liability for tax under subtitle C. Okay, so where is it that we have liability? That notice 609 triggers a return under 6001, 6011, and 6012? Where's the liability for tax? Doesn't appear to be here, does it? Well, let's see what the statutes tell us about the filing requirement. Now, I've done a short video on this already. This is the Paperwork Reduction Act from 1980, and they enacted this to stop the government from continuing to collect more information than was required by law. Under this act, every agency that works for every department and agency in the government had to send in to Office of Management and Budget, OMB, a cross-referenced list of forms used to collect information from the public, cross-referenced to the statute that requires the information on the form. OMB had to take all of this information from all the government agencies and research the laws and make sure that none of the forms had on them requests for information that exceeded the authority, requirement, and mandate actually put forth in statute. They modified and edited the forms, assigned them all each a unique individual OMB document control number, and assembled this table right here in the law that I'm showing you now. This is Title 26 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It implements the filing requirements, the forms, and the information collection requests that are authorized by law and required by any given code section. So what we're going to do is look up what form is required by law by the code section that imposes the federal personal income tax, Section 1. And that's right here in the table. This is Title 26 CFR Section 602.101 and Part 602. It's implementing the requirements of the federal IR code, Title 26. And over here on the left, we have the code section that imposes the tax. And right here in this first entry is the code section that imposes the tax. It's designated here as 1.1. 1.1-1, that's Part 1, Chapter 1, Section 1, Tax Imposed. And over here on the right, we see there's one form listed as being required under Section 1, the tax imposed. And they've listed not the form itself, but the OMB document control number, the unique OMB document control number that was assigned to the form by OMB. And then you have to use the tables to cross-reference what the OMB document is, or the forms themselves. Now note that if there's more than one form required, as in this 126-I, it's listed. Multiple forms are listed over here. Two forms are listed for that code section, but only one is listed for Section 1 tax imposed. So, if Form 1040 is the correct form for you to file to satisfy your filing requirement under law to file for all tax that you are liable for, the OMB document control number that appears on the bottom of a Form 1040 will be 1545, which is the prefix assigned to all IRS forms. It will be 1545-0067. So we roll up to Form 1040, and we're going to look at it right here. Here it is. Form 1040 from 1993, 30 years ago. OMB number 1545-0074. What? 74. That's exactly the same as 0067, right? No, actually, they're not the same. The LMB document control number assigned to the Form 1040 doesn't match the number listed as being required in law to satisfy the liability for tax. What's going on? Isn't this the form to use? And that's why they send 75 million of them to the US Post Office every year for everybody to go and get? Or is that just a de facto habit that the federal courts aren't authorized at law to enforce? They can enforce this law, this form, 1545, but they can't enforce the habit. Oh, I have a question. What form is assigned? 1545-0067 is the LMB document control number. Oh, look, here it is. Form 2555, foreign earned income for use by U.S. citizens and resident aliens only. Does Form 1040 say who's supposed to use it? And what did we see in Treasury Decision 2313? It was originally used by withholding agents the way a 1099 is used, to report the income and withholding of money withheld from non-resident aliens and foreign corporations, the only persons the withholding agent can collect tax from. And you remember I showed you that the tax had applicability within the territories and possessions in addition to being imposed on the foreign non-resident aliens and foreign corporations in the 1939 law? Did we go look at that real quick? Where did we find that? 1939, here it is. 1939, statutes at large. 1939 statutes at large. Section 4, special classes of taxpayers. Here are the classes of people subject to the income tax. States, partnerships, insurance companies. D, non-resident aliens. E, foreign corporations. F, citizens of any possession. G, individual citizens of possession who earn a large portion of their gross income from sources within a possession. China trade, foreign personal, mutual investment companies. We're citizens in the 50 states. Where are citizens as being one of the special classes? This is 1939, people, 26 years after they enacted the income tax. You don't think they had it all published in the law, captured and properly? They broke out all these categories of classes of people subject to the tax. They forgot citizens, which everyone just assumes. We don't need to list them. You don't need to list them because it was a tariff act this whole thing was enacted under. The Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913. A tariff is an impost, and an impost is the authority to tax foreign activity. And that's why non-resident aliens and foreign corporations are taxed, because they're foreign. And that's why people in a territory in possession are taxed, because it's foreign to the 50 states united. And we see that reflected when we go to look up what tax return form is required in the law. Form 2555, report all your income earned in the territories and possessions or in a foreign country under a tax treaty, as we're going to see in a bit. 1545-0067, foreign earned income. That's the form that's required by law, not Form 1040. You have been lied to and deceived and enslaved by this fraudulent debt service mechanism that reroutes your money not to the U.S. Treasury, but to the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation who is the beneficiary of all the collected tax and all the money sent in on April 15th, since it isn't actually tax. They can just route it to the bank as voluntary debt service by a nation of peons and slaves, compelled to service the $34 trillion in debt owed by Congress, the master on the hill, owed by the master on the hill to their ruler, the Federal Reserve Bank, that plays the role of the king. Here's the whole form from 93. Here's the 1040 from 23. There's 1545-0074. The wrong number. Still not required in law. Oh, and look. here in the National Archives. Truth is in the Federal Register, right? This. Our records indicate that the Internal Revenue Service has not incorporated by reference in the Federal Register a requirement to make an income tax return. The government admits it. The National Archives Office researched the Federal Register, the published law, and if the government hasn't given you notice through publication in the Federal Register of an enacted law, they can't take you into court on it and go, surprise, we passed this law when you weren't looking. And then we never told you about it, but now we're going to put you in jail for 20 years because you don't know it. Well, I don't know it because you hid it from us. That's not the way the law works. They got to publish it. So if there was a requirement at law for you to file a tax return, they would have found it. They wouldn't be telling you. They've never published any requirement to file a Form 1040 or Form 2555 because they don't want you to know that's what it's limited to. And if they published a requirement, that's all they could say. And that would give away the game, wouldn't it? Okay, this table is an incredibly powerful piece of evidence. When it was published after 1986, it began to be used by criminally and civilly charged defendants in court who were charged with a criminal failure to file a tax return. And when this evidence was presented to the jury, it defeated the United States government's DOJ. They lost these cases. When they started losing these cases, they decided this information was too powerful to have out there. So they removed the entry from the table. And they changed the OMB document control number on the Form 2555 to be the same number on the Form 1040, 0074. So now it's impossible to use the law to look up what's required because two forms have the same number, but even more importantly, the law doesn't show any requirement. I've been a little surprised about that. I've been waiting for 24 years for the other shoe to drop, which of course means they put a requirement back in the law, 1545-0074, and now the Form 1040 is required, and so is the 2555. You don't know which is which violates the rule. Every form gets a unique number so that they can be traced to the statute that requires them. Well, when the IRS looks at this, it doesn't make any sense. It's not limited. Everybody has to pay. They're our slaves now. They have no business claiming they're not part of the enslaved group of subjects, the non-resident aliens, the foreign corporations, the people in the territories and possessions, the corporations, the partnerships, the trusts, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms licensed sellers. Not limited. It's an unlimited power. Remember the 16th Amendment, unlimited direct taxation. That if it's true, federal courts couldn't enforce because there's no enabling enforcement clause in the 16th Amendment to authorize Congress at the constitutional level to write law, implement, or enforce the alleged power serving as the source of the claim that a tax is owed, i.e., the 16th Amendment and its new direct power to tax directly without limitation. It's all a lie. It's all a lie. And we reviewed that in both Parts 1 and Part 2, what the Supreme Court actually said the income tax is. It's an indirect tax in the form of impost, duty, and excise, where income is neither the subject nor the object of the tax. Income is the yardstick that measures the amount of tax owed on the earnings, profits, resulting from activity conducted under a federally taxable activity, something subject to an impost, duty, or excise. If there's no impost, duty, or excise taxation involved, there's no income that's taxable income to tax. It's either subject to an impost, duty, or excise, which your labor today still is not subject to, or it can't be taxed because impost, duty, and excise are the only three taxing powers granted by the Constitution that are made enforceable at law by a constitutionally authorized Congress to write that law by the original, necessary, and proper enabling enforcement clause, which authorized Congress to write law to enforce the impost, duty, and excise, but nothing else. No other form of tax, no other taxing power is enforceable at law. Congress isn't authorized to write law to enforce any other kind of tax. Impost on foreign persons, foreign activity, and foreign imports, duties on exported goods, excises on the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities within the country, on licenses to pursue certain occupations, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and on the corporate privilege, where it is the privilege that is the subject of the tax. And income is the yardstick, and profit is what the yardstick measures, or tax on profits. Okay? So the whole filing thing, it's a lie. April 15th is coming up. What's everybody going to do? Help these traitors in office now socialize America? Or ask for the automatic extension to deny them the use of the tax until it's legally due by law? Let's take a look at the assessment authority, because this is interesting too. This is why they want you to file the return for them. When you file the return for them, it becomes a voluntary self-assessment, and they can use it against you. So 6201 is the assessment authority in statute. This is what by law they're allowed to do. And it says, A, authority of secretary. The secretary is authorized and required to make the inquiries, determinations, and assessments of all taxes, including interest, additional amounts, additions to tax, and assessable penalties, imposed by this title or accruing under any form or internal revenue law, which have not been duly paid by stamp at the time and in the manner provided by law. Oh, excuse me? They have authority to make assessments of taxes which have not been duly paid by stamp? Are income taxes paid by stamp? How about alcohol? Do they have stamps on the alcohol bottles? How about cigarettes? Do they have stamps on the cigarettes? You're telling me this statute says that by law they're only allowed to authorize, they're only authorized the law to enforce ATF taxations by assessment. Those are the only taxes paid by stamp. Their authority to assess is limited to commodities, excises, stamp taxes, Title 27, Subtitle E of Title 26, ATF. Oh, but wait a minute. Such authority shall extend to and include taxes shown on return. Is that why they want you to file a return? Because if you don't file a return, they're not allowed to assess tax other than unpaid taxes payable by stamp and those shown on return. Here's the unpaid taxes repeated from A on the general authority of the secretary. Is that why they want you to file? Because otherwise they can't do it by law. And what happens if you refuse to file a tax return? Well, Section 6020 says, if any person shall fail to make a return required by this title or by regulations prescribed thereunder, but shall consent to disclose all information necessary for the preparation thereof, then in that case the secretary may prepare such return. So if you'll cooperate with them and work with an IRS agent and put everything down on the return, which being signed by such person may be received by the secretary. So again, you have to sign this return that the two of you work out together. So if you're just so frustrated or confused by the law, you can go ask the IRS for help. They'll sit down with you, go through the records, figure it all out, put the numbers on the return, help you do that, and then you have to sign it for it to be good. Self-assessed assessment. Now, what happens if you refuse to work with them or don't like the result of their helping you and you won't sign it? Execution of return by secretary. B. A is preparation and cooperation with the taxpayer. B is execution. If any person fails to make any return required by any Internal Revenue law or regulation made thereunder at the time prescribed therefore, in other words, if you don't do it when they demand it, or makes willfully or otherwise a false or fraudulent return, the secretary says, we don't like what he did, all zeros is no good. Then what happens? The secretary shall make such return from his own knowledge and from such information, like on W-2s and 1099s, as he can obtain through testimony not necessary. We have them all on file. Any return so made and subscribed by the secretary shall be prima facie good and sufficient for all grounds. So they have the authority to file a return for you. If you fail to file a return that's required by law, the secretary has the authority to file it for you. She has to sign it. So if a requirement to file a return has been failed to be charged under the statute with a failure to file a return, who should be charged? The secretary, who has a legal requirement to file returns for the person that are, if they're required and they aren't filed? Or you, for whom they can't show any requirement to file a Form 1040 because it's Form 2555, or no form at all? Because in the year 2000, I told you, they removed the number from the form. And now, from the table, you can no longer see that anything is required. Now, if 1040 is required and it's failed, it's the secretary that fails the requirement, not the individual. So it's impossible to charge a citizen with a willful failure to file. It's the secretary that has the duty to do so, not the citizens. Every single prosecution for failure to file has been a criminal fraud perpetrated by ignorant judges, enforcing opinion instead of the actual requirements of the law. Now, anyone who's ever been through a substitute for return process with the IRS knows that they refuse to ever produce the alleged document that's been signed and subscribed as required by B2 in order to be prima facie good and sufficient for all legal purposes. That means usable as evidence in court. They need a subscribed substitute for return. They need a subscribed return to be evidence in court. So how come they won't produce one? I mean, all they got to do is produce it, and now it's evidence enforceable in court. Why won't they produce one? Well, let's go to the Internal Revenue Manual. This is Chapter 5200, Delinquent Return Procedures, Section 5291. 5290 states it's the refusal to file, IRS 6020B, assessment procedure where the secretary has authority to file for you. And what forms is she authorized to file under Section 6020B as prescribed in the Internal Revenue Manual, which are the guidelines, instructions, and directions to the revenue agents on how the authority under the statute is to be administratively exercised within the operational practices of the IRS. The procedure applies to employment, excise, and partnership tax returns. I mean, it doesn't apply to individual Form 1040s? Only employment, excise, and partnership? Well, let's see. Generally, the following returns will be involved. Form 940, 941, employers. These are employers' reports. 942, employers. 943, employers. 11B, special tax return gaming devices. Form 720, quarterly federally excise, ATF. Form 2290, federal use. Form CT1, Employer's Annual Railroad Retirement. Form 1065, U.S. Partnership Return. So they can file returns for companies. Where's 1040? Where's 1040? 1040 is not a return authorized by law for use because it's not a return required by law because there's no tax imposed on citizens' labor or profits earned in the 50 states outside of any impost duty or excise taxable activity like ATF or corporate. It isn't there. Form 1040 is not authorized to use. That's why they won't execute one under 6020B. That's why they won't sign it. It would be evidence of a crime. Extortion. Not evidence of tax collection. It's not evidence of assessment. It's evidence of a crime. They signed a return. They usurped the authority, maybe, of some other office. But they don't possess it. The only forms they're allowed to sign are the employment, partnership, and excise tax return. Want more proof? Why don't we look at the delegation order? This is the delegation of authority to execute returns under authority of Section 6020B. Form 940, 941, 942, 943, 11B, 720, 2290, CT1, and 1065. Oh my goodness. Didn't I see that list somewhere else before? Oh yeah, right here in the Internal Revenue Manual. Same list, exact same list. These are the forms that the Secretary has delegated the authority to be used under 6020B. The authority may not be redelegated. It's delegated to all revenue officers GS9 and above. ATF and corporate employment. ATF corporate and employment. 1040 in there. It's not a legal authorized form for use under the 6020B assessment procedures. The only person that fails the filing requirement is the Secretary under 6020B2, and they won't actually execute a return because it's not lawful for them to do so. So what do instead? They make it up. They commit fraud by computer fraud and falsify data being put into the IRS computer system so that it can be used to trigger an examination assessment, because the IRS computers won't examine anything that isn't on a return. So they lie to the computer and tell it a return was executed when in fact none was executed as required by law. 6020B2, you got to subscribe it to be good and sufficient for all legal purposes. Now here's a letter from the General Accounting Office to Senator Moynihan on this subject, preparing substitute returns for individuals. Let's read what they say. IRS believes that potential non-filers who receive a substitute for return will be encouraged to respond by either filing a more accurate return, which is why they make it intentionally inaccurate, or showing that they have no filing requirement. Yeah, like they accept that, right? That's easy to show, but they try to ignore it. IRS is to give the potential non-filers up to 2 chances to respond to information showing the proposed amount of the substitute for return. If these individuals do not respond, IRS is to assess the tax shown on the substitute return and seek payment of the balance through its regular collection process. Wait a minute. How are they assessing tax? This wasn't in Section 6201. Where does it say make some nonsense up, exaggerate the amounts, send it to the taxpayer? If they refuse, enforce it as though it were in law? Where does it say that in the law? I showed you what the law says. 6201, taxes shown on return are payable by unpaid taxes payable by stamp and those on return. But where does it say you get to stick a fraudulent number into the computer and then enforce it if they don't answer it or deny it 3 times? Where does it say that? This is criminal. This is a written admission of the criminal process used. This isn't in the law. This is criminal. This is extortion. Pay us or we'll take your crap. And your good stuff, too. Agency comments down at the bottom. Oh, let's read this. We requested comments. They didn't have much to say, but Customer Service Division officials commented on the phrase substitute for return. They asked us to emphasize that even though the program is commonly referred to as the SFR program, no actual tax return is prepared. No actual tax return is prepared. Instead, these officials noted that IRS prepares a document that substitutes for the return and that proposes an assessment which is posted to the taxpayer's account and is subject to the collection process. Again, under what statute is that process implemented? That's fraud, that's extortion, conspiracy, it's criminal. No actual tax return is prepared. So that means there isn't anything that's good and sufficient for all legal purposes in court. There is no actual evidence that's ever created. That's what this is saying. They just make it up. They just make it up. The whole thing is criminal fraud. There's not one bit of law in any of this. This is the extortion that effects the enslavement of the American people outside of the law and compels them to service the debts owed to the Federal Reserve Bank by Congress, not you. You have no duty to service Congress's debt. It's a criminal system of involuntary servitude by voluntary allowance. Till you wake up and say no, and then it becomes involuntary servitude by peonage. How do they get away with it? Oh, well, if you're in this situation, you can go to the IRS online website, go to their account transcript facility, and get your account transcript for the tax years involved downloaded. Here's one. This is what they produce in evidence, as evidence, alleged evidence in court, instead of a return when they don't have one. They just produce an account transcript. We get down here at the bottom. The first transaction for the year is DD 150, substitute for tax return prepared by IRS. Now that's a lie. They've admitted they don't do that. They've admitted no actual return is prepared. So how did this piece of data get into the computer? Did somebody defraud the computer when they entered this, telling the computer there was a substitute for return? And look, there's a date and an amount. Well, wait a minute, zero. I thought zero returns were frivolous. You mean zero returns aren't frivolous? The government uses frivolous returns to start the tax year, and there is no return. This is straight up fraud by computer fraud. This is straight up fraud by computer fraud. This note is out of context. I got the PDF note text numbers, but you can see the amount is zero. Now, the reason why the amount is zero is because if they actually put an amount here, they would have to produce the return to show how the amount was calculated. But because they put zero, nobody ever asked for the return. And it doesn't exist. This is fraud by computer fraud. Now, this entry has to be made. You'll notice it's the first entry for the year. There are no other entries, but immediately what happens is when they put in the entry, the computer starts processing it. Without this, it has nothing to process. It has to have an alleged return in order to refer it to the examination division to be examined, at which point they tack on the W-2 and 1099 earnings and send you a notice for tax. But didn't they have the W-2 and 1099 earnings at the same time they created this fraudulent computer? Why didn't they put those documents, those earnings reported on this return? Why did they wait to the examination division? Well, again, as I explained, if there were anything put on here, somebody would want to see it to know how it was calculated. By zero, oh, well, there's nothing to calculate. It's a dummy record to trigger the examination process, which can't be implemented unless there is allegedly a return. You're being defrauded out of everything. The law, the rights, your property, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, constitutional government, constitutional taxation, freedom, liberty, sovereign power. Being defrauded out of everything. And here's the revenue ruling, 2005-59. And the revenue ruling says Form 870, which includes a waiver, is not a return filed by the taxpayer for purposes of Section 6013 and does not constitute a valid election to file a joint return. This holding also applies to Form 1902, Report of Individual Income Tax Audit Changes, and Form 4549, Income Tax Examination Changes. And that's what they try to submit in court as the evidence. These are the holdings. A Form 4549 is not a tax return. That's all they ever produce in court as the alleged tax return, the examination results. But there can't be an examination without a return, and they have to defraud the computer by computer fraud to make it think a return exists in order to examine the zero return, the frivolous zero return that the IRS used to start the whole process, which is criminal extortion. This is not law enforcement. This is not tax enforcement. This is criminal extortion. It's a crime of the highest order being perpetrated hundreds of thousands of times every year, if not millions, and tens of millions of times across the last 50 years. Criminal extortion, not tax collection. Okay, I think that might be a good time to cut off on this part 3. In part 4, we're going to start looking at employment tax law and the withholding exemption certificate and how all of this got screwed up and confused with voluntary withholding at work to avoid a large bill on April 15th, allegedly, which is at your choice. At your choice. So, this is Thomas Freed, tax-freedom.com. I hope you're enjoying the information. I hope I'm not being too overly aggressive with the presentation of it, but as you can tell, I'm emotionally vested in this. This is how we save America. This maladministration of the income tax is funding everything the socialists are doing to destroy the country. It's removing the funds from the pockets of the people where they could be more effectively deployed both locally and nationally in support of political policies that they support instead of those that we all abhor. So, it's over at taxfreedom.com. And you can get information and help dealing with the IRS at irszoom.com, where everyone should pick up a copy of The Simple Truth About Income Tax, which carries you through the first parts of understanding on all of this, and gives you the documents that destroy the federal government in court by exposing the lack of subject matter jurisdiction that the court has over what the government is claiming is the tax owed and the source of authority for it. So, and if you really want to get fully informed, pick yourself up a copy of the American Tax Bible, which is also available through the taxfreedom.com website, which links you over to the irszoom.com page that offers that book. They're both digital PDF downloads, so you don't have to wait for anything to come in the mail. They get delivered to you immediately by PDF download right after point of sale. So that's where we're at. That's where we're going. This is Thomas Freed at Tax Freedom and at www.tax-freedom.com. It's tax-freedom in both the YouTube channel and the website. Okay, I'll be back with part 4 in a bit.